Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Night of Ideas. So, a slightly different Night of Ideas this year. My name is Marc Bena. This is the 4th year I host the Night of Ideas, and it's a real privilege every year to come and host this. Normally, I would be in a big room with hundreds of people in front of me, but today we're at the Institut and with a very small number of people in the studio. So, my day job is to be a partner with PwC, where I lead the digital audit practice. So very different to what we're going to be doing today. But every year for me, it's really an amazing time to spend normally one night. This year is going to be 4 days, where we're going to have debates, we're going to see some movies, we're going to listen to music and really spend time together reflecting on what's happening around us. So the theme this year is together. So the reason together is so important, particularly this year, obviously a few weeks after Brexit. Many of us in England in lockdown, and some of you might be watching us in different parts of the world in different situations. But for us, this is time that is definitely troubled, and we are really thinking about how do we bring the community together. So we will start the night with Catherine Colonna, the French ambassador. But before we do that, I just want to thank the Institut français and the team. Frankly, have done an amazing job turning around the event, which was supposed to happen on Thursday, in one day into those 4 days. And you can imagine the amount of work that this requires, the organization and the flexibility of all of the speakers and the quality of the speakers and the commitment shows you, the importance for them of what's happening with the Institute as well as tonight's theme. So tonight we're going to have 2 debates and followed by a film. So the first debate will be feeling for others. And really this is about, in this environment, how do we work together? How do we care for each other? And how do we show the solidarity that is really all around us in this new environment? The second panel will be lonely together. So obviously many of you are at home, some of you are lonely, but we are all together. And so this is bringing a different dimension and probably an environment where normally we wouldn't be all together and having that audience and many of you watching on screen. And then finally, we'll finish the evening with a film from Éric Baudelaire, which is called Un film dramatique. So you'll be able to download the film on the website for a small cost of £2. So please do watch the film tonight or later in the week. So I hope you will enjoy the evening. I hope you will enjoy the next 4 days and you'll be able to join in different parts of the week. But with further ado, I'd like to introduce Her Excellency, the Ambassador, Catherine Colonna, who will do the opening of the night. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, welcome to the Night of Ideas, a night of debates and of important conversations about where we are at the beginning of 2021 and who we are. And hopefully a night of friendship between us here in the UK, in France, and across Europe. We all need friendship, don't we? But it is not only about us. The Night of Ideas is all over the world, in 200 cities and 75 countries, where all French cultural institutions and embassies are staging debates and discussions this year on a really, really important question. What does it mean to be together? Here in London, the Night of Ideas opened this Tuesday, and we decided, since we were all challenged by unusual and trying times, since we're all separated, actually, that we had to have several nights, not one, to explore what together means today. It will be Les Nuits des Idées, Friday included. So the theme of this edition, a classic and probably an obvious choice, indeed, when facing the difficult situation we've been facing for almost a year now. Our nights are intended to bring us together around these major questions: the uncertainty in which we live, the novelty of the challenges we have to face, the legitimate fear that some of us feel for the future. So many aspects that, in a way, we share, and are a strong invitation to come together to discuss, to confront our ideas, and to share our views. But what does together mean? What does it mean when I'm here and you there, and we communicate remote? What together mean when our life depends on the distance we put between each other? What does it mean when countries are redefining their borders? This week, we will offer you a conversation with a fantastic guest about the pandemic and compassion, on Brexit, yes, it is done, on Europe, on freedom of speech, on our differences, on diversity, and so much more. Before I officially open this first night, let me say a quick word on those topics. It is no news. The whole world is experiencing a pandemic. It is a terrible thing, and sadly, it can be a deadly thing. But it is also something we can learn from and must learn from. Among the positive lessons that we've learned last year is the necessity to emphasize how solidarities are crucial. During the first lockdown, we all went out every evening. We went outside and we clapped for the carers, clapped for the NHS workers. We all did it. I did it. At the French residence, we still have the rainbow on a window. Why did we do that? Because we knew that it was their everyday and patient work. That was the thread of life, that was fueling life. This is what really matters, care and compassion. How can we get the best out of that lesson now? Second, Brexit, Europe. The UK has left the EU. Now that it is done, what is the meaning of we when we say we, French and British? For France, this means a renewed commitment to our relationship, a desire to continue working with our partner, a duty to find new ways to achieve that, a common interest to think about the issues that faces us today. No country is alone in our world. The problems are still there, believe me, and there are so many crises and challenges and opportunities, we know that. So on a more positive tone, our artists do create together. Our scientists do experiment and find new medicines together. Our children grow together, study together. So we'll talk about that this week. Third, 2020 has been a difficult year in many ways, but not only about the COVID. France and the UK and other nations have been one more time victims of terrorism. We must and will stay strong and calm. France will. We will continue to defend and exercise our fundamental freedoms. Freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom to believe or not to believe, freedom to live in brotherhood. During this week, we will ask ourselves how we can produce a genuine debate of ideas, confronting ideas while avoiding intolerance, exclusion, lies, or ideology. Last and not least, the year 2020 was another important year in terms of struggle for a better, more inclusive and more diverse society. And I will be positive on this one. The place of women in the history of art, in science, their place in the artistic institutions and in contemporary art are being totally rethought by brilliant personalities. I'm happy to tell you that they will share their views with us. 2020 also raised important and difficult questions about our history. Black Lives Matter is a wake-up call and a door opener at the same time. Clearly, there is a need to rethink European history, or should I say, histories, because it's probably what we need. Plural points of view on our past to better prepare a common future. If France and Germany could do it, we can all do it. So here we are, caring for others, speaking together, living with one another, or looking at others, sharing feelings and moments, confronting visions and ideas. This is what together means. Est venue l'heure des traditionnels remerciements. The Night of Ideas is turned toward the future, side by side with younger generations. I'm grateful to their important contributions to our little night, to all pupils and students from several French and British schools in London. They've been working hard on these issues for months. I would like also to thank the Maison Française d'Oxford, the Bristol Festival of Ideas, the York Festival of Ideas, the European Parliament, the Austrian Cultural Forum, the Institut of Cervantes, the representation of the government of Flanders, the Goethe Institute, and many, many others who are our partners for this night. And of course, we had a close collaboration with the Institut Français d'Édimbourg and our network of Alliances Françaises across the UK. Many events are organized beyond London this week. I would also like to express my warmest thanks to the sponsors, without whom this event could not exist. First of all, the Trust of the Friends of the French Institute and its president, Marc, as well as eminent trustees and members of the French Circle. I would also like to thank the CIC Banque Transatlantique and PwC for renewing their commitment for this edition of the Night of Ideas. Last but not least, one more time, I express my deepest thanks to the Institut Français du Royaume-Uni, the Cultural Department, and the Higher Education and Research Department of the French Embassy. Thank you, team. You've been fantastic. Nothing would have been possible without you. You've been great, as usual. And let me tell you, you've been exceptional for the past 11 months, as we've been living a very unusual situation since February last year. The time has now come to open this night, but before I do so, I would like to ask you to join me in expressing our gratitude to Claudine Ripper for everything she did for more than 3 years now. And I'm sure I speak in your name when saying this night is her night. With more than 3 years and so many nights, actually this evening is not one evening, it is the evening of 1,001 nights. As your ambassador and as your friend, I thank you, dear Claudine, and best of luck for the future. As the musical goes, when they go in London, but this is lockdown, but as the musical should go, 1,001 nights is not enough to spend. The story has no end. So let us dare to be ambitious, the story has no end. Je déclare ouverte l'édition 2021 de la Nuit des Idées. I declare the 2021 edition of the Night of Ideas open. Have a lovely evening and a great, great night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you can't see the smile behind the mask, but I can tell you that the effort and everything that the team has done is fantastic. And having been working with the team for the last 4 years now, I definitely echo all of this and the hard work. So I'm sure you'll be enjoying and loving the next 4 days. And I think we're going to start really, really high with a unique conversation between the ambassador and Leïla Slimani. So this is unique. This is going to be very, very insightful. So we're going to invite Leïla, who many of you, most of you know. She's a writer, journalist. She's done She's written a book, Lullaby, for which she won the Prix Goncourt and was on the top 10 for 7 weeks after having the book released. In 2017, she was appointed by Emmanuel Macron as the representative for the Francophonie and la Culture. And so I think we will expect to, normally this evening is in English, but obviously we will have a little bit of French in the next 15 minutes or so. So I invite Leïla, who's in Paris, to join the conversation.
Hello, everyone.
Bonsoir, Leïla Slimani.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a great honor to have you here for the opening night of La Nuit des Idées. You know, the world is watching us. The 2021 edition of the Night of Ideas invites us to think about how we can find new ways of being together in this unusual world we live in. We're all separated. You are in Paris, I'm in London. We're talking to an international audience via the internet. We're not together. So we decided to think and reflect about what together means today. This week we'll have debates about compassion, inclusion, representation of women, of minorities. We shall also deal with free speech, ideological conformism and radicalism. But now I turn to you as your guest of honor for this opening night. Everyone knows your commitment to feminism, and I won't blame you for that. But beyond that, what social or political struggles do you feel close to?
You know, I think that both as a writer and as an activist, I've always wanted to fight for those whose dignity is not respected. I hate injustice, to watch injustice. So yes, I fight for women, of course, but I also try to fight for migrants and for people who are invisible, who are treated with contempt or with indifference. So I'm involved, for instance, with an association here in France that provides books to prisoners. You know that in France, more than 30% of the prisoners do not have any diploma. I think it's very important to give them the opportunity to read and the opportunity to learn and to think about something else than their situation. And I believe, very important for me, I believe that everyone deserves a second chance. So I'm also campaigning to improve the learning of French for me arriving in France. And of course, as you said, I'm very much involved in the fight for sexual rights in Morocco. So the right to have just a private sexual life, because in Morocco, sexual intercourse when you're not married are forbidden. The right to have an abortion, and of course the right to homosexual.
Since you're talking about French and French language, let's have a small conversation. It would diverse. I mean, much more time would be needed, you know, but let me ask you a question about la francophonie, because President Macron has entrusted you with this important mission to represent him as president and France in the International Organization of la Francophonie. Et il vous a choisi, évidemment, let me switch to French, parce que vous représentez un visage ouvert de la francophonie, ouvert sur un monde multiculturel, et parce que vous appartenez aussi à une nouvelle génération qui lui tient à cœur de mettre en valeur. J'aime une chose que vous avez dite, quand vous avez dit qu'il est important de lutter contre la tendance qu'ont certains à idéologiser les langues. Par exemple, en faisant de l'arabe la langue des islamistes et le français la langue des colonisateurs. Comment voyez-vous votre rôle dans cette mission que le président de la République vous a confiée, et que signifie le multiculturalisme pour vous personnellement, au-delà de votre mission?
Mais je crois que le président Macron et moi-même, nous parlons de la même vision de la francophonie, c'est-à-dire cette idée que la francophonie est un espace immense, multilingue, un espace de pollinisation, de créolisation, c'est-à-dire d'influence réciproque. Et on partage surtout cette idée d'ailleurs qui n'était pas très politiquement correct ou qui n'a pas été pendant longtemps, que plus le centre de la francophonie. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut arrêter de penser en termes de centre et de périphérie. Mais surtout, comme vous le disiez, un langage n'est pas le véhicule d'une idéologie, n'est peut-être même pas le véhicule d'une identité figée. Une langue, on l'embrasse pour s'émanciper, on l'embrasse libre. Moi, je parle le français, et c'est dû à un accident de l'histoire, parce que je viens d'un pays qui a été colonisé par la France, etc. Mais moi, je finis à travers le français, mais ça n'est pas le français qui me définit, ni même l'histoire de la colonisation. Donc, on défend avec le président cette idée que vraiment la langue est un espace de liberté, d'invention de soi, mais aussi un espace de dialogue. On parlait tout à l'heure de la langue anglaise. Moi, par exemple, j'ai beaucoup de plaisir à parler. Je ne vois pas du tout la francophonie comme une défense contre l'attaque d'autres langues. Au contraire, je trouve que plus on apprend de langues et plus on gagne en humanité. Après, pour ce qui concerne le multiculturalisme, pour moi, il doit être inséparable de l'universalisme. Il ne m'intéresse que s'il n'est universel. C'est-à-dire si on dit, oui, nous avons différentes cultures, mais au-dessus de ces cultures, il y a des valeurs fondamentales, comme l'égalité entre les hommes et les femmes, comme la liberté d'expression, comme vous l'avez dit, la liberté de croire ou de ne pas croire. Et je crois que la langue française, elle porte vraiment en son cœur cet idéal d'universalité. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut d'autant plus la promouvoir, parce qu'elle défend cette idée que oui, nous sommes différents, mais qu'au bout du compte, surtout, nous avons énormément de choses en commun et de choses à partager.
You are a writer. Est-ce que vous êtes un écrivain ou une écrivaine?
Je suis une écrivaine.
Vous voyez, la langue française est absolument merveilleuse. Leïla, you're both French and Moroccan, but you also say it's not so much this or that country that matters, but the language we live in. Since this night invites us to think about our proximity in our individual or in our collective relationship, who do you feel close to today?
You said I was a writer, and I think that as a writer, I feel close to every human being because I see both in their radical differences and at the same time as another self. Because, you know, when you write novels or even when you realize that even though we live in different countries, even though we believe in different gods, we all go through the same emotions. You know, when I was in Rabat and I was reading Anna Karenine, and I felt like I was Anna Karenine. I was living in Morocco in the 19th century in a big house with my parents. I had nothing to do with Anna Karenine, but I was her. And I think that today, maybe we tend to insist too much on our differences because we always express ourselves as women, white, black, homosexual. And even if I think that it's very recognized minorities, I think it should not make us forget that beyond these differences, we share the same humanity. And when you write, when you deal with life every day, you are very conscious of that.
Yes, certainly. As a writer, you know the power of words. Is it in the power of literature to... You do, I confirm, you're published everywhere, in the UK, obviously, and you're world famous. Is it in the power of literature to bring us, to bring people together? Or do you think of literature as something absolutely different that has nothing to do with that? In other words, does literature have a goal?
You know, I completely agree with Stefan Zweig, who used to say art is to unite human being. And that's what I believe. Yeah, sometimes, as I was saying, the book and the author expresses exactly what we feel and what we are not able to say. And that author may be from another country, from another time. Literature forces us to look beyond appearances and behind our social class, behind our identities, and it teaches us to think about what it is like to be a human being. So yes, of course, I think that literature has the power to unite us. And funny, and what is very moving, I think, is that when you read, at the same time you're alone, you're even sometimes you're lonely, but when you read a book that you love, you have a sense of closeness to the character, to the story you are reading. So it's like what we are living now. We are alone, and at the same time, through our imagination, through our mind, we have the ability to be with others. Tonight, I would like to say to people that we have an enormous power and a wonderful power that is imagination and interiority. And sometimes you feel very, and I know that this year is very hard, but as a writer and as someone who spends a lot of time alone, I invite you to go deep into yourself and to this imagination, because you can travel everywhere and you can escape and you can go in countries you've never been to, and you can imagine times where you can't even go. So yes, use your imagination, because that's the greatest power.
Many of us watched the inauguration of President Biden and watched or read the fantastic poem by Amanda Gorman. Do you believe that words can change the world?
Sorry, I couldn't hear your question. I couldn't hear the end of the question.
The poem by Amanda Gorman was absolutely inspiring. So my question was, do you believe that words can change the world?
Yeah, I think it was a wonderful moment, and everyone was so moved, and it shows also something that's poetry right now even more than ever, because I think that what this epidemic showed us is that we are not only who need technique and progress and money and all those things. We are also metaphysics being. We have metaphysics need. We need to understand the mystery of the world and the mystery of what does it mean to be alive, and all those big questions that I think we tended to forget, and we didn't want to look at this. More than ever, we need poetry, and we need the power of words.
One last question, maybe. We are just at the beginning of 2021. It is a strange beginning, actually. What do you hope for this year?
I think that what I hope, first of all, is that we reach the importance of knowledge, of rationality, that we need to fight against fake news and conspiracy, because knowledge can make us free. You know, as a child, my parents, they always taught me that if you learn, if you work, if you read, you're going to be a free woman. You build your freedom and your liberté intérieure through knowledge. So I hope that, and we'll become aware also that we, as human beings, we are not much. That what makes us great is our ability to create, to live together, and not only our ability to build computers and diffuser and all this, but our ability also to show some solidarity and maybe some poetry also.
Thank you so much for your words.
Thank you very much.
Un grand merci.
Merci
un grand merci.
beaucoup.
À bientôt. À bientôt.
Good. Thank you very much for this conversation. And I said it would be insightful, but actually exceeded, I'm sure, everybody's expectation. And for me, the message of hope that came from Leïla and the message of imagination, I think, is something that really carries all of us, particularly in this moment. So in terms of imagination, I wanted to first thank both Leïla and you, Catherine, for this conversation. And I would like to introduce the next session, which is talking about imagination, the young children of the community have spent some time thinking about together and what it means for them. So I will let the team share some of the drawings that they have done in this environment. So as you will see, I mean, Leïla talked about imagination. You can see these children really bringing together what they feel, what they live day to day, the message of hope, whether it's heart, whether it's about them showing how they live in the nature, how they engage with animals, how they engage with one another. I was talking to one of my friends whose child has done one of these pictures, and I know many parents who are watching here today, many of you are doing homeschooling, and I know many people in my team are doing homeschooling and trying to manage both looking after the children all day and spending the time looking at those drawings. You can tell that an awful lot of effort has gone from the children to think about, what does it mean for them to be together, all together on this planet. And I think that's what the pandemic has showed us, frankly. What happened in China this time last year felt very, very far away, and all of us felt that it would not probably coming to us, but there we are a year on. So this world of together is really bringing us into a different world. So we're going to stop now on the images, and I'm going to really start introducing the first panel of the night. So the first debate of the evening will be hosted by Rachel Cook, and that's about feeling for others. So this is really to recognize that, frankly, the new crisis has created some different practices and different ways of engaging with one another. So many of you will see, friends delivering food to their neighbors. Catherine talked about the NHS and the clapping once a week. We have seen people, feeling lonely at home, and then people organizing aperitif and ways of engaging with others who are feeling on their own. So that level of careness is probably something that we haven't seen maybe as much before, and a different way of engaging with one another. So Rachel has now joined me on the stage, and she's helped the Institute in many different occasions. And she's an award-winning journalist. She's a writer, columnist at The Observer, and the television critic of The New Statesman. So I'll hand over to Rachel, who will introduce the panelists for tonight, start the discussion for the first panel. Thank you.
Hello. As Mark said, I'm Rachel Cook, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to take my mask off in a minute. But in the meantime, welcome wherever you are. Oh, I can take it off now, I think. There you'll be able to see my full face. Wherever you are, welcome. We're going to be talking this evening about the new solidarities. What has this taught us about compassion, and how are we going to change the way we care for others in the future? There will be time for your questions at the end of our discussion. There are 3 people on our panel tonight. I'm hoping I'll be able to see them in a minute. I've never chaired an online discussion before, so you'll just have to bear with me while I get the hang of it. Here we go, wonderful. So our first panelist is Tineka Beekman. After a career in the academic world, Tineka became a writer. She has a PhD in moral sciences from the University of Brussels, and her most recent book was Machiavelli's Daring. She lectures on philosophy and she writes columns for Du Standard. Sandra Logier is a professor of philosophy at the Panthéon-Sorbonne and a senior fellow of the Institut Universitaire de France. She has extensively published on moral philosophy, gender studies, radical democracy, and civil obedience. Her most recent work focuses, this is very appropriate, on the politics of television series. And I think that television is something that has helped us all a great deal in the last few months. And finally, Christy Watson. Christy is an award-winning writer, and she has also been a nurse for over 20 years. The Language of Kindness, which came out 2 years ago, was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller. And she now has a new book, The Courage to Care. I read that last week, and it really is marvelous, really marvelous book. Christy holds an honorary Doctor of Letters for her contribution to nursing, and she is a patron of the Royal College of Nursing Foundation. She's also Professor of Medical and Health Humanities at the University of East Anglia. Welcome, all three of you. And before we start talking about the issues, I just want to ask all of you where you have been spending these various lockdowns, restrictions, and so on, and what you have been doing in this period, both in your work lives and when you're not working, what have you been doing to help yourselves? Sandra, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Okay. I start. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you all. So what have I been doing? I'm an academic, so I've been teaching online, and I know many of my friends and students also are complaining about that, but I really enjoyed somehow being in touch with my students this way. So this was not as bad as I thought, because the students, reacted differently. Sometimes were a little, less shy and so on Zoom. So it was an experience. What has been hard for me, because I'm working on moral philosophy, and my friends, the people with whom I work in philosophy are just around the world, and there are not many of them in France who work on feminism and ethics of care and stuff like that. So they are everywhere, and usually we meet very often, and nothing happens. So it's very hard to keep working. And so my luck is, as you say, that I'm working, and one of my subjects is TV. So I've been watching lots of TV shows and some shows that I, wanted to watch for a long time and couldn't. So I really had this feeling that these TV shows, and especially because they show lots of women, actually, the new ones, they are really somehow taking care of us during this pandemic. And this was a very interesting phenomenon for me, so I've been trying to write about it.
Do you have a recommendation of a show that we should all watch?
I'm sure we have the same ideas, but there was this marvelous recent show, so-called The Queen's Gambit, which is about a young woman who, plays chess. And I think it was very, empowering and rejoicing in a very sad time, maybe because it shows a very, joyful and powerful woman at a time where women, suffer so much. And I like very much watching The Crown too. Well, in France, everybody loves this show, I can tell you, to the British people. Yes, I think it has been very, very rewarding to watch TV.
And Tineka, where have you been through all this?
Well, I live in Antwerp, and I'm a writer, so usually I stay at home, and I very much felt how easy it relatively was for me in comparison to other people who I think were much more confronted with the difficulties of COVID. And I spend a lot of my time also taking care of my daughter, but also going out and going to the park. And fortunately, we were still allowed to go out. So it was a time of a very slow and intense homely life. But overall, it was okay, with the very strong awareness that in the outside world, for a lot of people, it was much more difficult. So it was, I felt very, very blessed in a sense, in spite of the difficult situation.
And Christy, what about you?
So I've had a mixed experience, really. I spent the first lockdown on the front line. I actually was a nurse that had come off the nursing register, and I was writing full time as a novelist, as a non-fiction writer, and a bit of TV writing, and I was involved with a theatre production as well. So I was doing all those things predominantly from home. And then the call came in the UK for nurses who were no longer on the register to go back to the front line because they were so desperate for people. So I spent the first lockdown working clinically, which was really traumatizing, emotional, stressful, as you can imagine. And I can remember being really quite surprised by friends and neighbours and family who were saying, "Oh, I'm so bored. This is the most boring time of my life. My Amazon delivery didn't arrive in time. This is happening." And I remember thinking, gosh, it's like we're living in two different worlds. And then this last lockdown, I've been at home working on all the projects that I've put on hold. And I find myself saying, I'm bored, the Amazon delivery didn't arrive on time. And so it's been really interesting how emotionally and psychologically I've moved from one space to another in a year. And it's given me insight into both worlds, I suppose.
And how do you feel about not being in a hospital at the moment?
I mean, I have an element of guilt about it, and there is a real pull to be with my colleagues who are quite literally on their knees in hospitals at the moment and desperate for help. But I'm also a single parent of 2 children and homeschooling, and you know, we have bills to pay. And so from a practical point of view, there really is absolutely no way that I could justify putting them through another situation where I was gone for 12 and a half hours or longer. So I do have the guilt, but I also have the practical side of me that says, you know, I did what I could when I could. And I suppose we're all just doing our best. We're all doing what we can.
And one final thing to you, Christy. We had something here every Thursday night in the first lockdown where we all came out of our houses and we clapped for carers. Given that you were one of the people that we were clapping for, how did you feel about that? I've never had the chance to ask someone how they felt about it. I did go out and bang on my saucepans, but I always wondered if it was, well, I had mixed feelings about it, and I wondered how you felt about it.
I think initially we all understood the need for communities to come together and express support in a very public way. As weeks went on and we began to lose nurses and other helpers and frontline workers, and as we began to lose people who frankly didn't have adequate PPE, and we started to see the direct effect of politics happening, then I think the tone changed and the mood changed, and it felt like it was more appropriate perhaps to start mourning the people that we've lost during this terrible time, and also to start holding our government to account.
Okay, first of all, shall we just talk a little bit about the fact that the world divides into two, really. We have the people who are, in theory, running the show, the politicians and so on, certain senior civil servants and bureaucrats, and then there are the rest of us. Tineke, I know that you have quite strong feelings about the role of government when it comes to doing good deeds, and that you feel that we are able to organize ourselves to a degree to look after other people, that we don't need instructions from above about that. Is that right?
I think instructions from above can be helpful, but the question is, what an idea do you have of the human being? And I think that I saw it in Belgium, but I think elsewhere too, that governments tended sometimes to have a rhetoric of war, of fighting, but also of controlling people, of checking people. They even suggested that drones would check whether during Christmas you didn't see your family. And so I think the more punitive approach is not the right approach. I think a supportive approach to the forms of solidarity that people are developing is much more important, and it requires a kind of trust. And there's also research on that because there was the assumption in the 1950s that should there be a nuclear war, for instance, that people would panic, so that the masses are irrational, irresponsible, possibly violent, looting, stealing, and so on. And so if a disaster happens, then you have to really check them, you have to control them. But sociologists found, and it's in the work of Rebecca Solnit, who wrote about the effects of disasters, that actually mostly people help one another out, and that people are profoundly social, and that in spite of the sadness and the grief and the difficult times, they really do find one another. And so the helpful government is a government who supports that, instead of sending the signal to citizens are not to be trusted and we're going to have to check them, because that undermines the solidarity more than it supports the solidarity. And I think in the communication, it's very often a little bit too negative, also to young people. And every time youngsters are discovered who don't do what they should do, it's all over the media. But the many people who do follow the rules and do their best often don't get enough attention, I think.
And in your community in Antwerp, have you noticed people organizing together? And I mean, is it something you can actually see and feel?
Yes, and there's a great resilience also for helping people out and finding new ways and bringing food to hospital workers, etc., etc. So in many ways, I think people do find ways of coping what's going on, and in very small local ways, you see that people do connect. Yes.
What about you, Sandra? I mean, is that something that you agree with? The idea that human beings are essentially good and kind and able to get together?
Yeah. You're talking?
I'm asking you if you agree with Tineke.
I didn't hear.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't
I'm
hear
asking
the
if you
question.
agree with Tineke.
Yeah. I agree totally with Tineke. I think what is really impressive in this crisis that is awful, there is a kind of, pedagogy of what is it to care for and to care about other people, and the word care, but also the word kindness. And I know Christy has written about that, has really been understood much better by many people. And also the fact that care is, being kind and taking care of each other. And this is the capacity Tineke was talking about. But care is also work. I mean, it's the care work that keeps everyone going. And so everyone was, of course, clapping, but also, for example, thanking the cashier at the supermarket. And, 2 months before, they would not even acknowledge her, and they would stay on the phone while paying, you know that. And now everyone, or most everyone, was kind of being very kind and grateful. And so it is as if everyone realized that there is all this care work that keeps us alive somehow. So of course it keeps us alive at hospitals, and this is what Christy was talking about. But there is also this care work in many front lines, like in stores, or in also in transportation, cleaning people. And so I think there's this kind of consciousness or awareness that appear that we are dependent on the work of so many people. And philosophically speaking, I think it's really a big change because everyone sees himself or herself as, you know, autonomous and strong, and at least trying to be. And we discover that we are vulnerable, that we are dependent, and that we need many people for, you know, for our life to be just normal. And so this new normal is very, I think, yes, it's very, very pedagogical. And as you said, you really have the world, two worlds. I mean, a world of men who take decisions, and you know, you always on TV, yeah, on the news, you always see men in France. At least it's like that. You see, you know, politicians,
like that here too.
doctors, and so on. And you have these women who are invisible, but who are doing all the hard work. And I think it's something that is really coming to consciousness. And this is why, you know, I've been working for a long time on the moral philosophy and the ethics of care. And I think the idea of care is maybe more maybe clearer and more understood by everyone now, because there's this whole network of activities of care. So yes, I think it's very important. And also the fact that even, you know, at the beginning, men were really at the center, because also many men were the majority of the sick people. But now we understand that women are going to be so terribly impacted by the pandemic, from the, you know, from a social and psychological, and just, you know, also about equality. And I think this is something that I think we have to be aware of.
Christy, what do you think about this? My sense is, there's a strange echo. My sense is that the lockdown, one of the things that you can say about the lockdown was that it gave you new eyes in a way, because everyone who, the only people who were allowed to go out and about were what we have come to call key workers. But that suddenly it occurred to us that key workers were not just doctors and nurses, but as Sandra said, delivery people and bus drivers. I mean, in London, the numbers of bus drivers who died initially of COVID, they were among the biggest group of people, because the buses were at first not very safe. And I think it's very stark. You have this sense of this world outside that just constantly is moving and never sleeping. It's a 24-hour world of all these very, very important people, while the rest of us, I'm not saying it's a luxury to be locked inside, but still we're indoors and those other people are outside. So it's very stark. We have new eyes, don't we? Is that how you see it?
Yes, I suppose, and I agree with everything that's been said, but the word compassion means to suffer with. And I guess this time has been philosophically very interesting, because for the first time, we are all suffering, no matter what degree that we're suffering in, we are all suffering. And so even though we are not suffering to the same level, we have some understanding that the world is not perhaps as safe as we thought, and we're certainly not as independent as we thought we were, and we are dependent on each other and dependent on those key workers who were largely invisible, as you said, Rachel. And we are all fragile. And so I think, although you know, care has always been a bit of a dirty word, really. I mean, we talk about people being in care, for example, as if it's a terrible thing, but actually having that social structure where you can have care for somebody is pretty amazing. Social care, again, has always been the kind of poor sister of the NHS. And that we are going to see some massive changes, because this pandemic will force us to have massive changes. So although I think these things are becoming visible and we're starting to talk about them much more and have some understanding, they've always been there. these problems of inequality have always been there. What the pandemic has done is it's forced us to see the racism, the problem with mental health in our society, the massive inequalities of gender. So it's really a positive that we are now having these conversations. That's one of the more optimistic and hopeful things that I hope will come out of the pandemic, is we're now opening our eyes very widely to this inequality.
Do you think, just to flip it upside down, do you think that people have also realised how good you feel if you get involved in compassion? My sense is that so many people are volunteering, and on the one hand, they're volunteering because they want to help out, they want us to get out of this pandemic, but also people are realising how wonderful it feels to care for other people. Of course, it's hard work and tiring and exhausting, and those people, if they're being paid to do that work, are very often underpaid. But many of us are learning how amazing it feels to get involved in these small acts. I mean, I can just give you an example from my own life, which is that I bought a load of silver foil takeaway boxes at the beginning of the pandemic, and every week I made food and I put them in the boxes and I wrote on the lids what it was, and I delivered it to friends who were shielding. And I came to realize that I was enjoying this much more than they were enjoying my cooking, because I felt like it just made me feel really good. And I think that that's a big change, and it's something that we can use in the future. It's something positive that we can use. I mean, what do you all feel about that? Tineke?
Yes, I think the focus on care is very, very interesting. And as a more political philosopher, I think up until now, before the pandemic, the strive for equality was very much focused on tackling privilege, the idea of privilege, namely that people have a kind of head start in society, that they owe their position and their prestige not only to their own merit, but to other conditions such as social economic wealth or the kind of conditions that gave them the head start to begin with. And privilege is also, if you fail, that you can cover it up, or if the negative effects of your failures, you can delegate them to others and things like that. But I think the pandemic has also shows that you also need a new and a very positive and strong concept of merit. And that up until now, that concept of merit was also lacking, that it was too often associated to creating value in a monetary sense, or also being able to draw attention to yourself and your own qualities. I think we live very much in a society where image matters, and where if you can create the impression and the image of being charismatic and successful, that you relatively are more rewarded than people whose focus is not on themselves, but whose focus is on the others. And if there is an upside to this crisis, I think it really shows how the previous model, if you like, really does not work. And also in a political sense, does not create a sense of citizenship. Merit as a citizen means that you try to do good things in difficult times, possibly at your own expense, but with attention for the common good and for the society that you live in, instead of this very individualistic focus or this focus on a definition of merit in a monetary sense, and the other definitions that it has had up until now.
Christy, what I was just talking about, is that something, because obviously you've worked as a nurse for a long time, you know what it feels like to care for someone. Do you think that our definition of care has expanded, as it were, and that part of that has to do with people feeling, oh, actually, this is good for me as well as the person that I'm looking after?
Yeah, I mean, it's very well researched that the thing that makes us the most happy is doing things for other people. But there's also a danger, I think, in this we've seen a lot of virtue signaling. We've seen Instagram influencers from the UK going to Dubai to give their wellness. We see there's going to volunteer in a food bank, for example, or Hollywood stars showing an anti-racism film. And I think there are much better ways of perhaps helping in situation. And if ever I see a millionaire in a food bank, I think, well, please give $1 million to the appropriate charity, or there are ways of doing it. But I do think there has been a movement towards a recognition that we do feel good when we argue altruism, which is another talk for another time. But there is whatever drives that, I think it's a really good thing. And as well as the clapping that went on, we did see people really looking after their neighbours, thinking of other families as well as their own. And I do think that's a really positive local community thing that's happened post-pandemic.
Sandra, what do you feel about this?
I really appreciate, hearing Christy and Tina Kenyo, because I think it's really, we all agree on the fact that, this care work is so important, and that it was there, and it was just more invisible, but also that, we have a kind of realization that there is something totally unbalanced, or even a kind of denial in our society, because what is most important, what we now have acknowledged as most important, is what is less considered and less paid. And so there's really this gender issue, because of course it's work that is done by women, and it is because it's done by women that it's traditionally underpaid, and now everybody understands that it's really, really central. And I think there's something also very, very unequal, because of course we have all understood, that every person in the world is vulnerable and can get ill. But actually, this vulnerability is itself very unequal. I mean, some people are much more vulnerable than others. So there's this universal vulnerability that has been acknowledged, and is really important, of course, for understanding humanity. But there is also this incredible inequality in vulnerability, and the fact that actually some lives count much less than others. And I think this is something that has been very striking for many of us. And you mentioned the race issue, for example, the fact that so many care workers are from immigrant origins. And so, of course, there has been a huge, they have paid a huge toll to the pandemic. And so there's and I find it kind of ironic that we speak about essential workers, which means that actually they are not essential at all, because their life count less than others. And I found it really, really shocking, especially in the US, but in Europe too. Alas, the fact you had this President Trump, former president, who got ill but got very good treatment, and you have all these Black and Latino people who are just don't get proper treatment, and the fact that there is such a difference in the statistics of death. I think it's something that has been very, very important, I think, about what has happened in the United States. I mean, the fact that when you hear the word Black Lives Matter, it becomes really even more significant, because all these Black lives has been considered as worth less than the white and more entitled people. So I guess that there is a big. So I do hope there is really a political change, because all these ideas have been maybe, of course, circulating and discussed, but maybe in the smaller circles and seen as radical. And now, everyone understands somehow that this is just, the description of reality.
In terms of the months that lie ahead, how can we hang on to some of the things that we've been talking about? I mean, there is a danger, isn't there, that when things become a little bit more normal, that we forget about all of this. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Tineke, perhaps I could go to you first. What your thoughts are about how we hang on to this feeling of connectedness and what we can do with it. The danger, it seems to me, is that as soon as people feel, assuming they do start to feel, calmer, less anxious, and things do improve, that we will turn our backs on all this.
Yes, that is why I think you need a different concept of merit, for instance, because otherwise those who already have more means to endure this crisis will also be the first to go back to normal and to go back to assessing, judging, appreciating, rewarding the way people and services and professions were rewarded, with not enough care for those who are essential workers. So that, I think, is one enormous danger. And I think also there's something very specific about this pandemic. Because on the one side, as you said, you have the world of the people on the front line, and then you have also the world of the people at home. And I think I'm also a bit afraid that the isolation, the detachment, the fact that internet is being used, unfortunately, not only to watch television series, but also to get disinformation, to be in contact with groups who have no constructive view of society at all. I'm afraid there's also a lot of rage, and you see that. And I think it's connected to the sense of being left behind, of not being connected in a meaningful way. And one can only hope that the energy and the hope that people have is directed in a positive way. But I'm afraid that when you look at the political situations, you see that a lot of people are really turning their backs on society. So I think it can also turn out in a way that we're even more removed from learning lessons from what's going on in order to improve a kind of imbalance, as Sandra and Christy have pointed out, that exists and that really needs to change.
Christy, what do you think about this, about how we can, earlier when we were talking, before we came on, you were talking about the dangers of apathy. I suppose what I'm talking about is even worse than apathy, which is that you just think, oh, well, that's over now, we don't need to worry about it anymore. But I mean, what do you, first of all, do you feel optimistic that we can hang on to these feelings?
I'm sure that we will forget very quickly, as I did from the first and second lockdown, sadly. It's amazing how quickly we can forget. But I also feel quite hopeful that science will cure us and then art will save us. I think we have responsibilities, all of us, in our own individual work. Academics and philosophers and writers, artists have responsibility about how we express these ideas to a much broader and wider public. And actually, I do think that television is going to play a huge part in how we find meaning or begin to find meaning in all of this, and also to translate that meaning to as wide an audience as possible. So I think the nature of art will change, and I think that there is great scope for optimism and hope if we are able to communicate in a different way to different people, so that we're not all in a bourgeois bubble talking about these ideas, but actually we're able to listen really carefully to people, but also to people from a wide range of backgrounds who disagree with us entirely. I think that's really important.
Do you think, Sandra, that there's going to be an appetite for political change, in people lobbying and campaigning for instance, to make sure that, you know, people, just on the most basic level, that people are better rewarded for the work that they do?
I think now there's really an agenda and everybody understood. And in France, for example, even, you know, the health minister has discovered, you know, the care work and say that, you know, we need to take care of people who take care of us. And they propose some raises in salaries, which was really insufficient, but it really expresses a new kind of understanding. But I think if we really want to have a political change, it has to be more massive. And I think it's really a matter of democracy, because as also Tineke was saying, you know, the politics are decided by more, you know, by men and the patriarchal society. And for example, all the committees, the scientific committees in France, but in many other countries, they are mainly, you know, constituted by men and doctors. You don't have nurses, you don't have, you know, patients as associations. And I think all the committees who make the decision should really be, you know, include much more people, include more women, include nurses, include include you know, doctors who work you know, in the cities at the basic level, and so this is the only way to have the right decisions, because you need to have the people who are actually involved and concerned by what is happening. So this is the most important thing. And everybody has also noted that, you know, in the countries where women had more positions of power, were somehow doing better, maybe not as much as we hoped, but somehow I think it's very important to have women in responsibility. And of course, it's not only because you need women to be, you know, president or prime minister, because this is not the only thing. It's really because you need to be in a society who gives a better place to women in general. And then, of course, these societies will be more caring and taking the right decisions. A society where you know, women's voices, but also, you know, other subaltern people who are suffering, but also people who are able to organize themselves in the cities. I think these people should have a voice and should make the decisions, at least more than they do right now.
Okay. Now, I'm going to get my mobile phone out. It's not because you're boring me. It's because I need to see if anyone sent me a question. So these are some questions from people who've been watching, and I'm just going to pick a couple of them. The first one is, can we learn from other societies, especially those regarded as less developed, in terms of interpersonal and intergenerational relationships? Mm-hmm. It's quite a big question, so who would like to answer that? Tineke, do you have any views about that?
So what strikes me is that a lot of the political questions are formulated in terms of individual rights. I have a right to, and who has the authority to stop me from doing what I as an individual want to do? And we owe a lot to that idea of very individual emancipation. But you see that in these times, it's really not sufficient to deal with the crisis. And so if there are cultures where the focus is more on the community, I think that indeed might be helpful. But more helpful even is if realizing, and this is very much with reference also to what Sandra and Christy have been saying, but also Sandra's idea of care, that being strong means that you are aware of your vulnerability and your dependence, and you try to organize society according to your dependence and your vulnerability, that is actually a sign of strength. And I think if people would realize that, it would be a lot easier to go away from a kind of individualism that is just too prevalent right now. It's important, but it may not be too prevalent.
Okay, now, Christy, this question is for you. We hear a lot of criticism when it comes to assessing European government responses to the health crisis we're going through. How do you assess these responses from your perspective as a health professional? That's also a very big question.
Was it in reference to EU governments or UK governments?
Well, the question says European government responses. I think you can probably only really talk about the British government's
I'm not in a
response.
position, I'm sadly not in a position to talk about EU responses. I can only that knowing the fact that we are now perpetrating the worst death rate in the world, that they're having better responses than we are. But perhaps Tineke or Sandra might be better equipped to answer that question about EU governments.
But could you just briefly say what you feel about the government's response? Our government's response.
Our government's response. I think that we were, the pressure now is to be reflecting on how the government has responded. And while we're hearing lots of narrative about the importance of putting that aside while the pandemic, the longer that things go on, the more urgent it is to actually look back effectively at what went wrong so we don't keep continuing to make these mistakes again. Certainly the biggest factor from what I can see from the outside, indecision. And the countries that have done particularly well with death hospitalizations have been the countries that acted very fast, very hard. So I think there'll be lots and lots and lots of lessons to learn, and we can't wait to learn them. We need to know them now, really.
Now, and I think we've got time just for one more. This is a funny question. Are only women caring?
Yeah.
Who would like to answer that?
I can start because it's a very philosophical question. Tineke will agree with that. Of course, women are not the only people who are caring. And we all know men who are very caring persons, and this is something that has been revealed during this crisis. But why do we insist on women when we speak of care? It's because historically women have been doing this work of care, and this is also because women do it that it's so undervalued. So it's a fact, and so women. But there's not, this kind of essential quality of women, which would be, nice and kind, because kindness is something that we are all looking for. But obviously, care work is something that has been assigned, and women have been assigned to, and so that's really the situation now. So of course, well, I guess I get Tineke agrees with that about this definition of care. It's something that is associated to women, but not always for the good reasons. That's what I mean.
Okay. Now we're going to share a few contributions produced by pupils as part of something called the Little Night Project. The Institut Français has invited British and French schools in the UK to create postcards on the theme Together. And these postcards, they look very sweet, reflect the way they interact with other people. If you would like to discover more about this project, please have a look at the Virtual Museum of Togetherness, which has been designed by students, and you can find it on the Night of Ideas website. Are those going to be shown? They've been shown.
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful. Actually, it's so cute.
Very sweet. Christy, I just wanted to ask you what you felt about the idea that are women only caring? Are women only? Is it only women who are capable of being caring?
It's a silly question, I think. You know, we know that men can be very caring, and we know lots of men who are caring and kind and compassionate, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the care sector itself, which is predominantly women, 89% of nurses, for example, are women, are suffering with inadequate pay, resources, respect, because they are women. So I think the way to respect care is, and the way to, I suppose, respect the men who are very caring, is to respect the women who are working in care already. But yes, I guess you know, we have been a very feminist panel, so I can understand the question in some ways. But of course, we all know men who are very caring and are lucky enough in our lives, I'm sure, to have caring men in our friends and family circle.
Now, here's another question. Would you agree that compassion was still a value of societies a few generations ago, and that it has somewhat disappeared because we've, in essence, become more materialistic and utilitarian, and even, the questioner says, technological? I think I'm interested in that question because there is a lot of nostalgia around at the moment, particularly in Britain. That was one of the engines of Brexit. And so we look back on everything with these strange rose-tinted spectacles, and the idea that, you know, our grandparents were kinder than we are. I don't know what I feel about that. Christy, I'm going to go to you first. What do you think about that?
Well, there's for any Welsh listeners, I apologise about the pronunciation of this, but there's a word in Welsh called heriaeth, which means rose-tinted glasses for something that never existed in the first place, or looking back on a home that didn't really exist. And I think there is an element of that, but there is also a sense of worshipping the cult of youth, of individualism. We do have a shift in values in our society to globalization, consumerism, all those things. And I do think that compassion, perhaps, that sense of community that feels like it's partially come back, or at least we're talking about it, is something really positive. I do wonder a lot philosophically about secularism as well, and whether this disintegration of compassion, as we understand it or as we think of it, it's got something to do with faith and perhaps and I'm not talking necessarily about religious faith, but a communal faith, a purpose, a shared purpose, and understanding. So I don't know if we've got time, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about this as well.
I would say that one thing that is different from our grandparents' generation is perhaps to do with things happening. My grandparents, things happened in the home. People died at home. Babies were born at home. There was just, and in my lifetime, things have been happening off stage, as it were, in hospitals, in care homes, and all of that. And that has been a change, and that perhaps is about to change back a little because of COVID, because we've really experienced the intensity of what it's like for someone to die when we can't be with them, for instance. And then that's making us rethink all of that. But I don't know, what do you, Tineke, what do you think about that?
It's a very complicated question, and I agree with what you just said, Rachel, that we have developed the means to move aside everything we don't like death, dying, disease, etc. For many people, it's kind of exported out of the home into a different world with professional people to take care of it. So that, I think, is indeed one side of it. my reticence to praise the compassion of the past is that very often it were then too the women who had to be compassionate. And so the whole burden of taking care also of older family members, of children, children of other people, etc., other family members, all fell upon women. And so I'm always a bit careful not to think that it was so much better in the past, because I think the possibilities women have had to say, I have a right also to decide what I want to do with my life and to take responsibility for their own choices without being indebted to following the consequences of other people's choices is a very important part of feminism as well. But what I do think about women and the caring is that, maybe not to think about the last question very briefly, is that it's also about recognizing care as a moral good. So I don't think that women necessarily care more, but it also has to do with admitting that in your assessments of moral values, care is very important, and not only individual development or other kinds of things. So,
Sandra, you were laughing then and agreeing.
Yeah.
What do you want to say?
No, no, really, I think I was thinking that obviously we are acknowledging care as something very central, and so obviously we have to associate it to women and to women's work, and somehow this is something that is really, really important, because it is also the moral quality of women, because they have all this work and they do this work. So I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged, but also the fact that if we compare to the past, what has happened in the past decade is that lots of functions which were at home, as you said, has been outsourced, and what is called by feminists emotional capitalism, so you can really have someone have your feelings for you somehow. And so this is something that is very, very disturbing. And during, this pandemic and the confinement, many people had to have, bring everything home. I mean, their feelings, the taking care of their houses, when usually they have helpers, and so it's something that is really important. But also because even if we are all feminists here, I think something that has appeared is also these incredible inequalities between women. I mean, among women. And the fact that even if we are feminists, women and Western women have gained their autonomy and have gained positions because other women were doing, the work for them, because it's not men that have been doing more work. And so maybe there is also this kind of consciousness about that is important during this pandemic. And when we speak about the invisibility of care work, it's often the invisibility of women who do the work that, other women won't do, and they are right, of course, not to do it.
Okay.
But there's
Well,
something, the question.
Thank you. We are just coming up to the end, so I just want to thank the three of you for dialing in and connecting with us. And I want to thank everyone who listened to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And for avoidance of doubt, men do care. So I just thought I'll bring a little bit of that masculine perspective to the debate. But again, a lot of hope in the messages that you shared with us, and really heartening to see what everybody's been doing in the community and looking at care in a different way. So thank you very much, Rachel, for this excellent panel. So we're now going to move to the second panel of the evening, and the next one is about lonely together and how really digital and technology, brings a different perspective again. So as I said at the beginning, I've worked for the last 20 years actually on technology, and I embrace and I love technology. And to be fair, I spent probably the last year on Zoom, on Hangout, probably a bit more than I would have liked. But it's clear that it's brought all of my teams together, all of the people I work together. And when I see my children and how they use social media to stay connected with their friends, and both in the UK and friends in other places in France, I think you can see how, social media in a way brings an element of isolation in some cases, but in other cases brings the ability to stay connected in a world where we've been asked to stay in our home, not go out, not, come close to each other. So I think we're going to have, again, a really good discussion tonight. And I'm going to invite Tim Markham, who will be leading the next panel. And Tim is a professor of journalism at Birkbeck University, of London. And he's a researcher who's worked across sociology, philosophy, and politics. And he's the author of a book called Digital Life. So for the next hour, all of our panel will now be dialing in online and will be sharing their perspective of Lonely Together and what it means for us and our community. So I invite Tim to join us and introduce the rest of the panel.
Panel Lonely Together. Social media bring individuals together and opening them up to the world while also enclosing them in bubbles of mimetic identification. We know that digital networks can increase social withdrawal, but it's also proved to be a unique way to combat lockdown loneliness. So the question that we are going to be grappling with over the next hour is the extent to which we can be emotionally connected in the digital world. In many ways, scholars have been investigating this for well over 100 years since the invention of radio. These technologies that bring us together, that collapse distance, they have the capacity to bring us together in really quite profound ways. And yet I'm sure we've all experienced that these connective technologies can also make us feel more distant than ever before. I know that 50 years ago, the philosopher Martin Heidegger invented of an era of what he called uniform distancelessness. This notion that the whole meaning of closeness and distance is just becoming less and less relevant. As sociologists, we've been really interested over the past year in the ways that we're all having to learn the new rules of social interaction, the way that we make bad jokes about Zoom etiquette or homeschooling or the visibility of pets in our work meetings. But the experience has also been one of really quite thoroughgoing a loss of absence. And so we need to try to make sense of this. The philosophers also tell us that even these experiences that can feel, sats and inauthentic, they can still be the foundation of something more profoundly human. It's just that we don't quite know what that is going to end up looking like yet. So over the next hour, we'll be hearing from three fabulous speakers from very different perspectives who are going to be exploring this idea of being lonely together and what it means to be emotionally connected in the digital world. Each of the speakers will give a presentation to get things started. And then we'll have a general panel discussion after that, where we will talk to each other about whatever themes emerge. And then we've also ensured that we've left enough time at the end so that there is a Q&A with everyone who is here. It's great to see you all here. We will be collecting any questions, any comments that you make on social media throughout the session. So anything that occurs to you, please do send that in to us. And then we will put those questions to our panel afterwards. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers this evening. First up, we have Faye Bound-Alberti, who is Reader in History at the University of York and co-founder of the Centre for the History of Emotions at Queen Mary University of London. She's published extensively on the histories of emotion, medicine, gender, and the body. Her books include Matters, History, Medicine, and most recently, a biography of loneliness, the history of an emotion, something which I think is going to be very relevant to us this evening. Second up, we have Manuel Arias Maldonado, who is Associate in Political Science at the University of Malaga in Spain. He's been a Fulbright scholar at the University of Berkeley and a visiting researcher in Munich and New York. He's published a book in Spain about the sentimentalization of politics and a number of papers on the digitization of social life. His latest books deal with the Anthropocene and, indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, we have Clémentine Lalonde. Clémentine is CEO of Once Dating Group, a graduate of the École Centrale in Paris and the Technische Universität in Berlin. Clémentine began her professional career as a project leader at the Boston Consulting Group. After gaining experience with some private equity and venture capital companies in 2016, she chose to leave the consulting world to join a school friend in developing a dating app called Once, which I really hope we're going to hear lots more about this evening. So Faye, if I could turn to you first of all, I'd just like to ask you about your thoughts on this topic of being lonely together, given that you have written a book on the history of loneliness.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. So I'm a historian who researches emotions like loneliness, as well as the history of medicine and body. And I've been thinking a lot pre and during COVID about the historical meanings of connection, which is arguably the most appropriate linguistic opposite that we have to loneliness, given that there isn't one. And I've argued that loneliness is a modern rather than a universal or inevitable state, and that it appeared around 1800 in the Western world as a response to social, economic, political and ideological change, including industrialization, urbanization and the cult of the individual. And this history matters because loneliness and a lack of connection is a societal rather than an individual problem. For all our language of an epidemic of loneliness that focuses on the psychological and the individual, we need to attend to its history and its specificity, including what connection and loneliness mean to different people at different times. And I think relatedly, in terms of today's discussion, we also need to think about the lonely or connected body. And the very idea of loneliness as a mental health problem is itself historically situated. It stems from the separation of mind and body in Western medicine in the 19th century, when for the previous 2000 years, they had been joined. So the emotions, the physical and the spiritual provided a holistic idea of the self. Now, digital media provides many wonderful opportunities for connection and engagement. And in some ways, it seems to me it fills in for and brings back some of the sense of belonging to a world outside of ourselves that did exist in the pre-modern world before industrialization and urbanization, when there was a sense of a universal God or a universal point. It allows us to make these incredible connections that have no heed of place or time. And it also offers new ways of understanding what relatedness might mean in the 21st century. So I'm not in favor of arguments that discount the emotional importance of social media as a form of connectivity. Not least because who knows where we would have been without social media during COVID. And I think it's really important to note too, that any new technology has caused concern in the past about how people relate and about their mental health. In the 1870s, people worried that the telephone would prevent people talking in person, for instance. And there was advertising for the telephone for farming women in particular, and a lot of concern linked to that women would spend all their time talking and not enough doing their work. There was also concern that people would lose the ability to actually engage in physical connection because they couldn't see the person in front of them. And this all sounds really familiar, I think, in terms of anxieties about how young people use the internet and computers. So there's always been a historical precedent in being anxious about technology and its effects on communication. I think what's critical about whether digital lives make us lonely or connected is that people use social media the ways in which they use real life relationships. And we often forget that, and we imagine that the two are completely disconnected. But the usage and the ways in which people engage and create connections online varies, like the very emotions that make up loneliness, according to a person's experience, their gender, their age, their location, their ethnicity, the kinds of connections that they want to form from others, and their ability to make connections at all. So some people are lurkers in real life and lurkers on the screen. And we find that the same patterns of behavior translate in online and offline relationships. But it does seem to me that the kinds of people who are least likely to find real connection online or a fulfilling, sustainable sense of connection are arguably those who lack real life relationships as well. So there are some very interesting studies showing that if people have a mix of online and offline relationships, that can be very fulfilling, but only online is the problem. And from my position as a historian of emotions and the body, that seems to me that this is because the virtual world is inherently disembodied. As social animals, we need touch, taste, smell, and material engagement with the physical world around us to feel connected to others. And this is why nostalgia and heirlooms are so important in giving people a sense of themselves as belonging to something bigger. So a bigger story about our identity and our place in the world. Now, with a multiplicity of possible worlds in the realm of the digital, many of which are just based on interest rather than actual shared lived experience, I'm curious about how we share experience that can become rooted in the body and the sensory and the physical world in ways that might last, and the social, technological, and emotional ways we might mediate the digital and the physical worlds in search of connection. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest challenges, really, as we move through COVID into whatever kinds of pandemics exist in the future. What kinds of ways of communicating online and through digital media will be able to connect to and adapt to our need to exist as physical, embodied people seeking connection? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye. Lots to follow up on there. I really like this observation that the arrival of every new communications technology across history has caused concerns about mental health and, as you say, productivity and all the rest of it. And you've also brought up, I think, the critical dimension here of the role of the body and of physicality in actual space. Certainly, I've noticed that in my own research, the way that we feed off each other, it's a kind of energy to be co-present in a place. But it's not to say that the virtual is somehow unreal. Anyway, lots more to discuss. I should be quiet and move on to the second speaker. Now, Manuel, I'm sure you've been listening to that with interest. Would you like to now give your introductory remarks?
With pleasure. I'm very happy to be here. Well, I'm at home, but there as well. Well, in my view, in order to understand emotional connection through social media, and especially in the context of the pandemic, I think that we have to establish what do social media allows us to do and to feel as well. And what kind of emotional connection do they facilitate in particular? And on this respect, I think that social media is different from other media, and especially from phone-to-phone conversation and messaging in the sense of SMS messaging, in that we are immersed in them. We live through media rather than just connect ourselves to media from time to time. And this means that we are incorporated into a continuous flow of digital activity that takes place live, without geographical constraints. Social media allows us to inhabit a kind of third dimension of reality that is nowhere in particular, but seems to be everywhere. And on the other hand, social media enables us to express ourselves, either anonymously or under our own real names, in many different ways, creating our own persona in front of a potentially large audience whose members we rarely know personally. I mean, we know some of them, but most of them we don't. So I would say, to begin with, that social media features immersion, simultaneity, and a paradoxical combination of enclosure and openness, because the world can feel also a bit claustrophobic once we are within the context of social media. So my first proposition would be that digital media have in themselves a powerful emotional effect whose main feature is the feeling of connectedness that it provides, irrespective of the particular connections that each of us is able to establish through them. So it belongs to the artifact, so to speak. It is an effect of the whole that goes beyond its different components. And I think that we should not overlook this effect, because in my mind, it is key for understanding the allure of social media and the internet writ large. And I think it helps to explain why we feel drawn to the smartphone or the tablet or the computer. They are brimming with activity, with life. And in the end, to be emotionally connected is to feel emotionally connected, no matter how shallow that connection may be in some cases. And I think that social media provide that feeling. The fact that social media are highly entertaining, on the other hand, I think that has played a political role during the pandemic, as it has made it easier for governments to impose lockdowns. I think that the screens offered us relief as well as escape. A second point I would like to make is that we should recognize the connective role of negative emotions. I think that it would be an analytical mistake to speak of emotional connection only in regard to positive emotions such as hope, joy, relief, or even compassion. I think that negative emotions such as outrage, fear, sadness, or resentment also create emotional bonds among those who feel them in relation to the same object, if possible. We feel in company as well, we feel understood, we feel supported. No wonder then that social media are a place in which contention and polarization takes place abundantly. And while this in turn may seem a recipe for disconnection, I think that emotional connection takes place as well with negative emotions, especially among members of the same moral tribe or in-group. And yet, this being my third point, I will make 4 overall, I believe that the existence of social media has created the conditions for perceiving COVID-19 as the first truly global disease, or if you prefer, the corona pandemic as the first truly human one, beyond ethnic or regional differences. In my view, at least, for all the media sounding the alarm about a wave of xenophobia triggered by the pandemic, I have seen nothing of the sort, or at least nothing significant. On the contrary, there seems to be the widespread feeling that humans are threatened by the virus as humans, regardless of their ethnic or national background. And this is a tendency that was already apparent in relation to climate change, I would say. And to me, social media is a key driver for the self-identification of humans as members of the species, which means as earthly creatures subjected to environmental and planetary pressures. Natural catastrophes, after all, can very easily elicit a sense of community, the community of the affected, which in this case means at least potentially all humans. And finally, I think that, and this connects with something that Faye was saying about embodiment and disembodiment, I think there is a point to be made about the larger connections that these trying times of the pandemic have revealed, and which social media can both hide and expose. Ironically, the pandemic is about the human connection to something that exists outside of you and which pertains to the biological aspect of our existence, which is a virus that can go viral without having a Twitter account. And as much as social media can help us to realize this wider biological connection, as we discussed with others, I think that it can also hinder its recognition by disembodying our daily activities and creating, hence, the wrong impression that life begins and ends on the screen. While in fact we are part of a larger network of beings, entities, assemblages, and processes. And while, of course, a dangerous virus does not invite emotional connection, I think that the pandemic suggests the need to avoid digital withdrawal and pushes us to recognize that there is a materiality to life that should not be neglected. And that's all. Thank you.
So again, lots to discuss there. I mean, I certainly have the experience of myself of seeing social media as being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. I turn to it like it is a place. And I have all of these expectations of it. I project all kinds of emotions onto it and often leave feeling quite dissatisfied before returning again. So I think understanding that space is really important. Another thing which is really, as you say, little understood and under-researched in academia is the role of negative emotions. We know this, that back in the day when we could commute, that those feelings of resentment towards others around us have just as much of a role in gluing us to that situation, in making us feel connected, maybe too connected to other people in a situation like that. And so also these other feelings like loneliness and anxiety as well, they also define connection and not just disconnection. And yes, we've come back to the idea of the body again, but especially reminding us, as the pandemic has done, of our status as a species above all else. And it reminds us of really what it means to be human when so much of our experience of the digital, of social media, seems to be disembodied. Okay, well, let's turn to our third speaker now. Clementine, over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and very happy to be here. So, I'd like to bring a point of view of a specific industry that has the purpose, or is supposed to have the purpose, to bring people together, which is online dating. So I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an engineer by training. And started for pure coincidence in the magic online dating world 6 years ago, and ended up continuing in this industry because I believe this is fascinating, undervalued space where there's a lot of innovation that is still to come. Starting maybe with a few figures, in the US, I believe the figures are from 2019, 40% of the new relationships started that year were online couples. And it's actually 60% when we're talking about same-sex couples. And some projections are planning that 70% of the babies that will be born in 2040, so in a few years from now, will actually be born from online relationships. So the share of relationships and therefore emotions and human interactions that are coming from online dating services, wherever they come from, is increasing, steadily increasing, and is about to actually become the first source of relationship before meeting via friends, before meeting at work, which used to be the main social vector for couples to be formed or relationship to be formed. Just to tell a few words about Once, because it's really not about that product, but so Once is an app that is basically based on slow dating, with the belief that dating space right now is very much like a supermarket, basically in the 1990s, pretty oriented towards volume and hyper consumption, and wants to bring back quality to online dating, and in particular with our AI-based algorithm that proposes your daily match. So basically with Once, you have one match a day, every day at noon, because we believe quantity is better than quality, not so much for the quality judgment, but because fighting against quantity brings back what is essential, which is the time and mental space and availability and focus that you need to actually make an encounter and start a relationship, whatever relationship means, and meeting someone. So I think this thinking that we had when we create once is actually takes an interesting dimension when we first talk about the dating space, basically, and what the dating space is doing right now to bring people together. And if the job is done properly, that will be my first series of comments. And especially in the time of pandemic, of a pandemic, and that would be kind of my second, type of remarks, because obviously this is a very special time we're living, and it accelerates to a certain matter, to a certain extent, this movement of more and more people meeting online. I would argue, and I would actually agree with many remarks that Faye and Emmanuel did before me, that we should be really, critical about the capacity of technology of bringing people together. And if you think about what I'm going to call the swiping apps, right? So swiping is this gesture of moving a profile from left to right or right to left, depending depending if you like or not or don't like this person. This is what's like the bulk of dating is today, right? So you can scroll up and down if you're on Meetic or Match.com, like this kind of web-based services, or you can swipe on your phone. But if you think about it, like, this is the bulk of what those services are offering today, which is very low technology. If you compare with the technology that is embarked with many of your apps you have on your phone, it's actually relatively low technology. It's a list of profile, it's geolocalized, but that's what it is today. We can ask ourselves why there's so little technology, in a sense. While we're trying to bring people together. The second criticism we could do is the anxiety that this type of service could or can generate. This is the type of remark that needs to be analyzed by gender, even though it's not about telling women are this way or men are this way, but the reality is like, dating services today are very imbalanced, and on many services there are many more men than women, and so my take is that the technology today is actually bringing anxiety both for women and for men. For women, because they're handled as products and they end up being spammed because there's so few women, basically, or less women. They get more messages. And they end up with notifications, that they have 843 matches to check, which is, for the first 2 seconds, very flattering, but then, creating anxiety, FOMO effect. What if the right one was in this list? And for men, it also creates anxiety, which is basically just kind of endless swiping and a silence, basically, because the proportion between the number of actions they do and the number of messages they actually get, or number of people they actually end up chatting with, is very low. And so we could say, without kind of being too, exaggerating too much, that there's a vast proportion of people today that are using online dating tools, but are also really frustrated with them because of the Netflix effect as well, that reinforces the behaviors in terms of endless scrolling. Mean, I don't need to pay attention this much to this profile because there's someone else, there's so many else anyways. So this impoverishment or diminution of the value that you bring to one interaction, and also the time that is consumed using those services. And the last part that is important in analyzing what this market is today is the algorithmic logic behind the services. Algorithm behind those behind the profiles. So whenever you see profiles on dating apps, they don't show up just by coincidence. They show up because algorithms decided that this is the right person for you to see. And it's public knowledge that some algorithms, so typically the Tinder algorithm, not to name them, are, as an example, designed to favor couples where the man is older than the women and has a higher social status, social level than the women, which is, not common knowledge, and it's an implicit bias that seems to me, at least, and especially as a woman, extremely dangerous, and which would mean that this algorithm embarks a number of, I would say, old-fashioned type of logic that should then dictate, and possibly create the majority of relationships that will happen, which seems extremely worrying. So after I have saying all of this, there's still hope in that technology can help us meeting and also, experiencing beautiful stories, because that's what it should be, right? And here, I think the pandemic and this time that we're living, which is obviously, causing so many suffering and frustrations, is really interesting for the dating space. And let me tell you why. 5 days after the lockdowns have been decided across Europe, dozens of people came to me and said, wow, Tinder is going to be bankrupt. They were like really worried about that, which is a fair comment, right? Because, you cannot jump in the bar and meet anymore. So why, be online? Which says a lot about our representation of what online dating is and what it should play as a role in our lives and in our social organization right now, which is poor, And what is also really interesting is to look at what happened. What happened is not the bankruptcy of Tinder. Good news or bad news, the match stock, which is the mother company of Tinder, actually never been that high. It's been kind of to the roof since the pandemic. But Tinder has communicated that they have recorded on, I believe, March, their absolute record number of daily swipes, which was 3 billion, I believe. I'm not sure if it's good news or bad news again. And what happened is really interesting is that unlike what people thought, maybe, feeling emotions, being moved, falling in love, actually belongs to the category of essential goods. There's been those fascinating debates whether, shampoo was more essential than books, and so nobody talked about love. So love is essential. Good news. And that means after a week of, I guess, stupefaction, where everyone was just busy with, shopping and organizing their lockdown, we've seen curves, not just us, the entire industry, of so more active users on dating apps, like 30-40% during the lockdown. And what it says is that, yes, it is important to continue inventing ways to meet, even if we have to wait to meet in person, even if it's truncated, as you said, Faye. And even a dating profile today is a stupid flat image with your picture and 10 lines, which is like, so little versus what you are as a real person, with the sound, the voice, the movement, your entire being. And so I guess it speaks a lot for continued innovation, disruption in this field, and also an urgency to probably reinvent the dating etiquette, I would say, the online dating etiquette. And I think that's what everyone, or what all singles at least are doing right now. They're rewriting the new dating etiquette.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Clementine. Again, loads of things to unpack there. I think what was really refreshing about your comments were first of all, there's this, I think, blanket assumption amongst academics that online dating is essentially about the commodification of relationships. And I think what you've shown is that, well, sometimes that is the case, with some of these more mainstream platforms, but that there are different ways of doing it. But also that if meeting online is becoming the new normal, if that is how most children are going to come into the world, then it's just lazy thinking to assume that that it's all bad news. And there's an associated thing here for me. I mean, first of all, not from an academic perspective, but just as someone who's not had that experience, I worry about that FOMO effect, and that people will constantly be looking over their shoulders or looking at their phones more likely to see maybe they have made a connection with someone, but they could be someone even better around the corner. But then the second assumption, which I think you've really caused me at least to think twice about, is that we often assume that when new technologies become somehow influential in the way that we interact as human beings, that it's degrading, that it's making us slightly less human before. And I think what you've demonstrated is that, well, no, technology is a perfectly normal thing to be a part of how we connect to each other, part of human relationships. And so it's a question of really thinking through, I guess, how that works. As you say, there's depends on the algorithms. Some algorithms are better than others. We don't tend to understand them. We tend to categorize them as being these kind of black boxes. But I think there's plenty of room for doing things differently and also better. So that then brings us on to the main discussion part of our panel this evening. Clementine, just because your remarks are still fresh in my mind, I wanted to ask you a follow-up, if that's okay. And it's around this question of, well, what does it mean to be together? What does it mean to be in a relationship? I wasn't sure from what you were saying if you think about dating apps as just a different means to the same end, right? So people have pretty much always wanted this universal thing of finding another and maybe forming a commitment or whatever it is. So do you see social these social media and dating apps? Do you see those as different tools by which to achieve that, or has something fundamentally shifted, changed in the way that we conceive of, think about these relationships?
I think it's something that is also very much to be defined, because new generations, people in my team that are 20 years old definitely don't use those tools the same way I used it, and certainly I don't know, my mom would use it or had used it. So I think the market right now tends to be segmented in two type of groups. There's the group of services that are focused on this very pure idea of the ideal love and the one long-lasting relationship. It's very unique, Prince Charming type of projection. And what interestingly is typically targeted to kind of, I would say, older generations. So people that really want something serious, that really want, the relationship. And then there's the rest of the market, which is very casual, very, like the cool new apps, which is really new if you think about this, because if you remember, probably 10 or 15 years ago, nobody would admit they would be on dating apps. It was like, yeah, I have a profile, but I don't look at it. I don't need it. This is what would be the reaction. So those dating apps tend to be, they don't talk about love. They don't use the language of love. They talk about fun. They talk about experiences. They talk about also positiveness and, living who you are, the way you are, your way, and distilling much more the experience. It's really interesting to me to see that, for example, like what we're working on with Once is typically in the middle, probably people that are looking for emotions, meaning they would not put a time frame on the relationship. They would, they would typically say, I want to live a beautiful moment, a beautiful story, regardless of this story is 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, or 10 years, because it doesn't matter really. And so, it's it feels very much like a still unstructured, market where you can virtually, look for anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Faye, that really, I think, chimed nicely with what you were saying about the cult of the individual, because I think what we're seeing is that, if our understandings of love, of relationships, are fundamentally a product of modernism, of the modern age, then this is absolutely associated with particular economic structures or historical realities. Would you like to come in on that?
Yes, absolutely. And I was really interested with what Clementine was saying about gender and how men and women might use these apps differently. And fundamentally, you said something about whatever a relationship looks like. And that's fascinating, because that's absolutely what it's about, isn't it? In searching for connection, we're often all looking for different things. And those sort of differences of gender, experience and ethnicity and so on. I mean, there are the stories, and actually, both Manuel and Clementine talked about stories, and these are, we all have these stories that are influential to us, whether it's the romantic prince, or the bad boy, and all these things that enter into our cultural language. And absolutely, there's a commercialization element here, in that, as individuals, we cannot be ashamed of using these apps and go out into the world and use them to our own end. And that's a really interesting shift, as you say, in the last 10 years. What I did find fascinating in what you were saying, and what Manuel was saying too, is there's a really interesting relationship between the emotions that are individual, and hope kept coming up for me a lot in your discussion, Clementine, because it's very much about, the idea of that perfect someone, or the idea of some sort of connection that will be meaningful. And on the other hand, that's both an individual and a collective yearning. And in Manuel's discussion, very much about the ways in which these huge collective emotions, whether they're negative or positive, take on this kind of language of their own, and yet it's possible for people to conceive of them as individual emotions, even though they're part of that collective. So I do think there's a lot of sort of entanglement there between what is felt and experienced at an individual level and what is communicated and enters part of this kind of cultural language as collective emotions. So I find that absolutely fascinating.
Yes, I think that there's definitely something there about, I think we assume, we use this term affect a lot as academics, and we assume that when we feel something like hope or anxiety, that surely it must be the same thing as other people are experiencing, and not just now, but across history. I think that's certainly a lazy assumption that I tend to make. And you're right that it feels different to different people, and it has real world effects. And Manuel, I was wondering if you'd like to come in on that, on this relationship between things like hope and then despair and anxiety on the other side.
Well, I think that this speaks about the essential ambivalence of both the emotional world on the one hand, and on the other of the internet itself. I mean, it's futile, I think, to try to make a definitive judgment about the quality of the internet, as much as it is futile to try to find a conclusion that is definitive about our emotional world. I mean, there are both sides to almost everything. And in this sense, I was thinking that something that we have not commented upon is how digital networks create the possibility of a kind of emerging loneliness or emerging disconnectedness within the home, when people who belong to the home are devoted to their own smartphones and try to establish connections elsewhere. I mean, which are the real world effects of digital networks? In this sense, I think that something was said about that. Digital networks create the opportunity for big assemblages of emotion to emerge, and probably they favor the global, the national, and even the regional, maybe at the expense of the local. I'm not sure about that. I guess that empirical evidence must be gathered to reach this conclusion. And I was also thinking, when I was listening to these fascinating considerations about dating apps, that they are somehow a driver of globalization, of homogenization, and perhaps Americanization, because I was thinking in the Spanish context, and the typical dating system in the American way, which facilitates trial and error, so to speak, was something that here never happened. I mean, it was very difficult to approach people and to find someone, mostly a matter of chance. It was very difficult to approach a girl in the street and say, let's have a coffee, okay, let's have it. And so this is changing. And I guess that new opportunities are there for young people. And I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, although, of course, it can have wrong effects sometimes.
We're still on this discussion about dating. This is a really speculative question, but I asked you before about the way that how the way that we think about relationships is changing. Do you get any sense that people will have different expectations of relationships after the pandemic? Are there people who are more interested in a more digital kind of relationship, or do you think that we will head back to some kind of normal, even if that normal is different for generations?
Yeah. We get many signals, not just from our base, but really from the market and globally, that people will be more careful, which seems like terrible to say, really, because not only we're suffering from the pandemic, but we also expect long-term effects. But I think the care or it's not as negative as it seems. It feels like people start realizing, let's put it this way, let me try to explain. One of the very perverse effects of dating apps as kind of a way to generate a lot of relationships, from few apps, is this distance you have between the screen and yourself, right? Because suddenly the person you're speaking to is dishumanized. You're in your pajamas swiping on Sunday night, and then this other person seems so far away, right? With the pandemic, actually, you realize that we are all on our couches at the same time because we're all kind of in our places, right? So it feels like, I think people start to talk more humanly to each other in the sense of realizing this person behind the screen is actually a person. That's with all what it's, has as consequences in terms of what is appropriate and not appropriate to say, what's the right empathy level. What is this entire kind of emotion feedback loop that disappears, right? When you're kind of, you're fat, this kind of, this famous Simon Sinek talk, right? I think about, how screens are kind of destroying our capacity of empathy. And I think, the pandemic and within this sphere, which is the specific case of singles on dating apps, is creating more empathy. And also is creating this logic of, okay, probably swiping to the death at 2 to have a date at 5, meet at 6, and sleep together at 8 is not possible so much anymore, and probably for so, which is why I named this new dating etiquette. And so if you say it differently, we have many circles that people will probably be more considerate in terms of what's the volume they're gonna handle, if I'm just talking math here, and how they intend to take more time probably to move from the point where you first hear from each other and you're two complete strangers, and this other point where a relationship is about to start and you actually want to know more about this person,
Yeah, indeed. So Manuel, I know that you spoke about simultaneity. All right. So Clementine has just, I think, rightly emphasized the awareness that we all have, that we are all doing the same thing at the same time, and that does seem to have some kind of transformative power behind it. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would certainly agree. just think of the difference between watching a movie on television, while a lot of people are doing the same at the same time, or choosing a DVD at your house. I mean, people tend to do the former rather than the latter. So there is an energy that it has to do with collectivity, and also the feeling that the internet is somehow a box of surprises that can be open for you at any time. We know that things happen there, so why are not they going to happen to you? And I think that's part of the attractive, that of course can be related to all kinds of, real world events that in the past have been fed by that sense of both simultaneity and urgency. I mean, talking about mass events and unforeseeable situations in which there is a collective energy that transcends the individual. And I think there is something on the internet that speaks to us about that, but also it allows us to keep our distance, which is not a bad thing. It's a good combination of both worlds.
Indeed. Now, we've been talking a lot about how everything has changed with the pandemic, but also with digital media more broadly. But Faye, you also mentioned I think the really powerful role that nostalgia has been playing. Could you say a bit more about that and how you think that is defining this way of being lonely together?
Yeah, I've been really interested in this idea of lonely together. And one of the things that's really struck me, people write to me a lot about their experiences of loneliness. And often they write to me to say, I love the fact that we're in lockdown because I don't have to pretend to be sociable. I don't have to go out. Mm-hmm. And more fundamentally than that, people who have traumatic family relationships or people who are constantly experiencing that FOMO when they feel like their lives are less than other people and less than the kind of curated selves we found online. There was a real sort of collective sigh of relief that actually you don't have to pretend to be at the bar. You don't have to pretend you have plans. And I guess this translates also to the online dating space, because you don't have to pretend you've got all of this active life when you're trying to, meet somebody new. But one of the challenges of that too is that after the first lockdown ended and people went back to their families and back to those relationships, those same people who felt this sense of togetherness and closeness and through the idea of doing the same thing as other people felt far more bereft than they had before. So that's quite interesting to me, is that we have this language of loneliness and isolation and this language of the digital media bringing us together. But at the same time, that language allows us to have these kinds of conversations, which are phenomenally important. But for people who don't have those kinds of connections, that's not a sustainable sense of engagement in the long term. So in the same way that we see the pandemic affecting people very unequally, and in a sense being a kind of, it's not really bringing people together at all in terms of socioeconomic issues or who's actually affected. There's a worrying temporariness, I think, this sort of idea that we are inhabiting this space. So I think that's my reflections really on this sense of togetherness. And it can't, I suppose fundamentally, a lot of what we're talking about is these collective movements and experiences, but very, very complex individual responses. And I think that those individual responses are too kind of broad and diverse to be able to view as kind of overall positive or negative.
I was thinking especially about both yours and also Clementine's comments before about gender. And how the pandemic has obviously had very unequal effects in terms of domestic labour and childcare and care of parents and everything else. But homeschooling is a form of connecting people, which is just really hard work for a lot of people, and it's a responsibility that does not fall on everyone equally. So yeah, there's loads more to unpack, but we should turn to the Q&A section of tonight's session, because we've had lots of great questions coming in. By all means, if you're watching, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, there's still time to do so. So the first one that's come up here, it refers to some interesting research, if you remember, I think it was about a decade ago, by Susan Greenfield, Baroness Greenfield. I know that there has been some pushback to this, that there are some who argued that the scientific basis of the research was not necessarily completely sound, but it was this suggestion that digital connectedness is actually rewiring our brains so that our neural connections are just different than they were 20 years ago. And she also mentioned someone called Michel Desmauget, who I'm afraid I don't know. Right, so it's saying that digital technologies are leaving their mark on our brains, and that what we are witnessing is an actual mind change, like climate change. So this is a fundamental transformation in what it means to be human. Would anyone like to respond to this comment?
I think fundamentally in terms of being able to expect kind of speeded up connections, as Clementine was saying, I think we can see that at work. And I'm very open to the idea that there is this constant two-way relationship between cultures and how we express ourselves and how that becomes internalized, whether it's internalized through language or internalized through the physical structures of the brain. I'm very open to that idea of a sort of a relationship between the individual and collective that is constantly evolving, and that our body is constantly evolving in relation to the outside world. So it's certainly something that I would like to see more evidence about from neurology.
Yeah, I likewise, I agree. There's this concept called originary technicity, which really stretches, it really stresses the way that we have always evolved in tandem with technology. It's not making us less human necessarily. But Manuel, it seems to me that really it speaks to your comments on what it means as our status as a species in the Anthropocene.
Absolutely. I think we don't have enough evidence yet about what kind of change our brains can undergo as we adapt to digital technologies. But I think that it is obvious that it changes our culture and it changes the way in which we feel towards others. And I think that this interaction, this dialectic between culture and biology is obviously one feature of the new technologies. And I was wondering, in a rather frivolous way maybe, whether do we smoke less just because we have the smartphone in our hands all day? It's a possibility, and it speaks up to this question of the interaction between habits and technology and culture. I think it's an interesting point, but I don't know if anyone will research that, unfortunately.
Yeah. I know that one thing about smoking, I have colleagues who smoke, but they would never smoke in a Zoom meeting. There's just something, there seems to be something taboo about it, because it's not something that you'd be allowed to do, at work, that it's somehow inappropriate to do in this kind of a situation. Now, the next question is specifically for you, Faye. It says here, in your book, you emphasize the need to rethink loneliness in old age. We're living longer and longer. So how would you assess the emotional impact of living longer on the loneliness of senior citizens?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I've been struck by is how we have a very a single definition of an elderly person who's lonely, and it's always it's often an elderly woman looking out of her window bereft of companionship. And there is this idea that we are we need to pop round, we need to visit, we need to kind of cultivate community, and at the same time as denying all of the different kinds of experiences that can be attached to loneliness and social isolation, whether it's bereavement and grief of widowhood, or it's jealousy that somebody else is having fun, or it's all of the complex positive and negative emotions we might associate with loneliness. When we have this image of elderly people and their relationship with loneliness, we just iron out any of these complexities and this idea that we can actually make a difference. And the other thing that we do is that we as a culture, we architecturally reinforce this idea of separateness and isolation by the ways in which we run old people's homes, for instance. And there's been some really interesting Scandinavian experiments where you mix students and elderly people together, and because there's no reason why people would feel a sense of connection to other people necessarily simply on the basis of of age. So part of it is, and then I think also there's this element where, you know, elderly people are often seen as redundant to a kind of commercially profitable society, and that's part of this obsession that we have with age in Western culture, with youth in particular. So I think that this kind of cluster of ideas around old age and loneliness really prevent us from addressing elderly loneliness as a problem. And when the government started being very concerned about loneliness, it was primarily in elderly people, and primarily because it's a burden on the NHS, it's a burden on the social care network. But the reality is that many elderly people now don't have basic care or basic health provisions. And so my argument is that then we have a different kind of loneliness. So we have existential loneliness, which is feeling separated and disconnected and bereft of a kind of an intellectual or affective companionship. But then the structural loneliness, which is not having someone to help you with your dressings and not having someone to make you a cup of tea. And what we do is we talk about loneliness as though it's this one thing. Particularly in relation to old people. And it's only when we drill down into its complexities and what unmet needs are there that we can really have any hope as a society of tackling the issue, I think.
Absolutely. So this echoes really nicely with some of the other comments that have been coming in. So we have one here which says technology divides, it doesn't promote togetherness, millions are excluded. So it's making the point about unequal access to technology, to laptops and how we can ensure that. But then there's another one here which I think really is right on the money. It says, should mutual help, solidarity be the new indicators of national wealth, right? So we're not just thinking about money when it comes to quality of life and mental health and all the rest of it. But it is about connectedness. It is about togetherness and how they can be promoted and what that would actually take in terms of resources. We've also had some quite metaphysical questions, or existential, as you just said, Faye. Can you be, or are you the same person online as IRL in real life? Would anyone like to have a go at that? I know Mark Zuckerberg famously said 10 years ago, you have one self. He doesn't like the idea of us being different selves on different platforms. Clementine, I'm guessing you're quite relaxed about this idea of people being different according to what platforms they're using, who they're interacting with.
I guess this is a fascinating question, and it's one of the one of the big flows, I would say, of the technology, using, especially in the dating space. So not talking about people that kind of are, maliciously, obviously, not presenting who they are, but really talking about anyone who will try to think about this critical question, which is, what are you going to write on your dating profile? And I think it's really interesting to see that right now the dating services are not helping to not helping you to present yourself, but they're really kind of geared towards marketing. Why? Because most of them, most of the most successful platforms are actually obviously designed like a hot or not type of question. So half of the users are taking their decision whether they're going to speak to a profile or not in less than 20 seconds. So it's everything is geared towards self-promotion, self-marketing, beautiful pictures, fun words, spicy words, or attractive, positive qualities, which is obviously not in favor of reflecting complex, rich personality, or just we're not just kind of marketing profiles. And also what is really interesting is that on top of this kind of marketing game, which is creating this bias towards not presenting yourself as who you are, there's this belief as well that you should behave on dating apps as what a Swiss researcher on the dating space, which is fascinating, is describing as the homo economicus behavior, meaning that anyone who use dating app is here to maximize their chances to find the best optimum for them. And so this belief is really scary in a sense of it creates the belief that there is an optimum, there is a number of criteria that you should meet when you meet someone. There's a number of questions that need to be answered, and so that that for me is kind of making this distance between yourself and your profile even bigger, because you're kind of let's say polluted by those beliefs that you're trying to optimize your life, of be with a person who loves rock and roll and not classical music, right? And it's interesting because statistically, when you make this kind of choices, you end up systematically with someone the opposite of what you wrote down.
Indeed. So I think the horrors of self-branding, right? I'm afraid we're out of time. There's so many different avenues that we've been exploring. Clearly, there are in many ways more means than ever for connecting. Some better, some worse, some more substantial, and some less. And the impact of all of this, well, we're barely scratching the surface, it seems, which I think there's going to be loads of fascinating research to follow. Anyway, I'd like to thank all three of you for your really insightful perspectives this evening, and thanks for coming together, even though we are, of course, alone in our own homes. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Tim, for hosting this final debate. As you could see, I am now nearly alone in the studio because the guests have left me, hence the mask coming down. I just thought I'd share my own experience, actually, and one of the things that resonated was the fact that you're in, just single dimension in some of these platforms. So I've been actually using virtual reality to try to experience this, and during lockdown, I actually sent 20 headsets to one of my teams, and we all got together to share and experience that collaboration of feeling a bit more that connectivity with one another. And the best part of all of that, so we did the usual brainstorming and talking to each other. But actually, the best part was at the end of the session, we created some virtual table in a virtual outside world, and 3-4 of us sort of got together in different tables, and you could teleport yourself from one table to another. And that connectivity and turning your head and looking at people in the eyes, virtual eyes, feeling that they were next to you, was just bringing a very different dimension to that connectivity that maybe you don't get on a Zoom or Hangout. So maybe something to explore at the next session, from telephone to social media to virtual reality. And I actually took it to the next level and joined the Jean-Michel Jarre concert on New Year's Eve. So I ended up going into that cathedral, listening to Jean-Michel Jarre. I ended up next to a group of German people talking to each other. So, all of these definitely brings different communities together and a different way of exploring it. So let's see what the future is going to be around this. So let me now, before we present the last session of the night, I just want to invite you to join us tomorrow and Thursday and Friday for the next sessions. Hopefully you've enjoyed tonight. As expected, we've had some really exciting and fantastic discussions with all of our experts and people coming and sharing their own experience. But tomorrow we will start with the screening of L'Apprentissage at 6:30. So that's the first episode of a 3-part documentary series, Décolonisation, switching from French to English, bringing a new understanding of colonization through the point of view of the colonized. So that's at 6:30, and you can download on the site. And again, there's a small fee of £2. And then at 7:30, you can join us for the panel of the evening tomorrow, which is Old Empire, New Empire, on the rebirth of imperialist temptations. So another exciting debate for you to join tomorrow. So for the final event of tonight, we'll invite you again to watch a film from Éric Baudelaire. So it's a fantastic film. Éric spent 4 years with students in a school in Saint-Denis at Dora Maar Middle School. And you will see the perspective from the students and how we followed them and get some real insight from that community. So Éric Baudelaire actually won the Prix d'Arcel Duchamp in 2019 for his film. And I really, really recommend, and if you have the opportunity tonight or any other night, I think it will be available on the site. So if you can't watch it tonight, you can still watch it later on. So this is the time to close the first night of ideas, to thank the team. So in front of me, you know, we have the team technicians who've really made a fantastic job at keeping everything running. I often start these events saying something is going to go wrong because we're using technology. So I didn't want to jinx it. So I didn't say it, and I'm glad I didn't say it because they did a fantastic job. And again, a big thank you to the Institut for their support. And I look forward to talking to you again tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. Have a lovely evening. Thank you very much and enjoy the film.